Welcome, everybody, to the Max Weber interview series. I'm Vanessa Villanueva, Max Weber Fellow at the UI, and I will be conducting this interview with my colleague, Ivan Romashchenko, also a Max Weber Fellow in law. So we are delighted today to have Professor Anu Bradford. She is Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School. She is a leading scholar in the field of EU law and its regulatory power, and her expertise focuses on digital regulation, international trade, and antitrust. She is very well known for her studies on the Brussels effect, a term that she has also coined, and we will start this conversation on her latest book, Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And now I will leave the floor to my colleague Ivan to start this conversation.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for giving me the word. Professor Bradford, thank you very much for your time and for the opportunity to have this interview with you. Your new book, Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology, names the EU as one of the three dominant digital powers in the world, which connects to your previous book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. So my question is, can you explain more about the link between the two books?
Yeah. So first of all, Ivan and Vanessa, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to sharing this conversation with you. So Digital Empires builds on the Brussels effect by looking at, again, what is the EU's place in the world? But now I'm focusing on the EU's place in the digital world, where often the public conversation describes that world as being dominated by two leading technological superpowers, China and the United States. And we have a lot of focus on the unfolding tech war. And often the question is, how does the EU navigate this tech war, and whether the EU is actually forced to choose between the Chinese digital world and the American digital world, lacking a robust technology sector on its own. So in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not able to, nor are they forced to, choose between the US and China. Instead, the Europeans have pioneered a very different vision and regulatory framework that charts a path towards a different kind of digital economy and digital society. So in the book, I look at three leading regulatory models: the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European rights-driven model. And I look at how those three different regulatory regimes collide in the digital world, and how do the companies navigate then those collision, and what kind of digital society emerges from these different visions and the collision among those visions.
Thank you very much for the exhausting answer. And in your book, you're talking about three digital empires. So do you think it is possible that more digital empires will emerge in future, or maybe some will cease to exist as digital empires? And on a related note, can we say that there are the so-called digital colonies?
Sorry, what was the last one? There are so-called digital
colonies.
Colonies, okay, very good. So obviously the digital world is very dynamic. So I don't expect any model describing the digital state of the world to remain stable over time. There are movements, some empires rise, others fall. But I think today it is fair to describe that there are three leading digital empires, the three that I focus on in the book. But at the same time, there are other digital powers. I would highlight India, that is increasingly decisive player in the digital space. India is very well known for its digital public infrastructure. It has technological capabilities. It is large enough of a market that it is not just going to be a colony, if you like to use that term, or at the mercy of the other three digital empires. I would say India is an example of a jurisdiction that selectively emulates aspects of the regulatory frameworks developed in the European Union, China, and the United States, and then chooses the kind of hybrid model that serves its society the best. So if I take an example, India emulates very closely the European data privacy regulations, so the data protection law, the GDPR. But then India adds various data localization provisions that are very similar to the ones that China has in place. So that is an example that we don't necessarily see India fully embracing or finding itself in the sphere of a single digital empire. But I also talk a lot about in the book how these three digital empires are shifting in their relative influence. And it is so that the American digital empire has been very dominant until recently. So today's digital economy is really a manifestation of the private power of American companies that were set free to take over the world under the market-driven regulatory model. But I also trace how that, what I would call excessive or outsized influence, has created a backlash around the world. And now the governments, both in democratic and authoritarian countries, are stepping in, looking to rein in that power of the American tech companies. So we see really the American digital empire waning, losing some of its significance when the ideology, these values behind the market-driven model no longer resonate around the world. So there are many countries that are now following the example of the EU and asserting states' regulatory powers in order to enhance the relative power of users, individuals, society at large, and not just leaving the digital society to these digital tech giants to govern. But we also see a lot of resonance and movement towards the Chinese digital authoritarian state-driven model. So I trace those shifts in relative influence across those three dominant digital empires today.
Thank you, Professor, for this exhaustive answer. I'm also following on the success of the Brussels Effect book. And a few commentators interpreted that the EU regulatory power was stifling innovation. And this also builds on your new work that you presented here at the EUI. Others argue that the EU regulatory approach is a data protectionism approach. So do you think it is the case that the lack of innovation might lead to a regulatory data protectionism? Or is the EU data protectionism or the precautionary principle embedded in the EU regulatory power over these digital technologies that leads to a lack of innovation? Or there is no correlation at all?
So Vanessa, I am quite concerned about the state of European tech sector. So Europeans can innovate. There are many leading data scientists and other researchers, excellent entrepreneurs, but somehow we have not managed to translate all those capabilities into sustained growth of the tech sector. And there it's tempting to conclude or to say that, well, it must be because the Europeans are regulating the digital economy so heavily. So I don't believe digital regulation is the problem, why we don't see the European variants of the leading tech giants like Google or Meta or Apple or Microsoft. I think there are more foundational problems in the European tech ecosystem that prevent the European tech companies from growing, scaling, and getting funded in the EU. So we still lack an integrated, robust digital single market. The market remains too fragmented for many European tech companies to scale and grow in the EU. The same thing, we do not have a complete capital markets union. So often the European tech companies are very successful in the first few funding rounds. But as soon as they need more funding, they need to turn to American venture capital or are acquired by leading US tech companies. So again, I think the lack of funding is a much more important explanatory variable for why we don't see the same kind of growth of the tech sector. We also have very punitive bankruptcy laws, and generally attitudes towards risk-taking are very different in the EU. Failure is often fatal, whereas in Silicon Valley, it is a rite of passage. It's built into the whole venture capital model that entrepreneurs are encouraged to take risks. And even if they fail, they know they have a second chance. And I would also highlight a fourth factor, which is you cannot be the leading innovator unless you have the leading innovators, you have the talent. And Americans have been much more successful in recruiting from the global pool of talent, whereas the Europeans would need to have a much more consciously crafted, ambitious immigration policy to fuel the global talent into the European labor market. So I think there are those issues that the European policymakers should really treat as salient and address so that we also create opportunities for European tech companies to scale. But Vanessa, let me also mention when you discuss data protectionism and you allude to the set of policies that I see now emanate from many conversations in Brussels, which is that there is concern about European competitiveness. So the response in some quarters is that, well, what we need is industrial policy, or we need techno-protectionism, we need techno-nationalism, so that we bolster the growth of European national champions. And some take it as far to say, like, look, we need to convert our merger policy to a tool for industrial policy. We need to use that instrument to build those national champions. Or others who say that, look, we really want to shed those dependencies from the US and Chinese tech companies. We need to pursue data localization. And that is something that concerns me quite a bit, because the Europeans have a superpower. They have regulatory power that often has global impact. So if you take the Brussels effect seriously, you need to understand that it is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if the EU converts its entire regulatory architecture into a tool for techno-nationalism and protectionism, the EU can become the world's biggest exporter of techno-nationalism. And those are then the kind of rules that European companies encounter when they try to compete on global markets. And that is not a path to European tech success and competitiveness. So the book also tries to be cautionary and issue warnings that, yes, we need digital regulation, but that regulation needs to be consistent with those European values around fundamental rights and fairness and preservation of democracy that have explained and continue to explain why it has been a successful regulatory model. And it should not be converted into a tool for sort of unconstrained industrial policy.
Thank you very much for your answer, Professor Bradford. My next question is about correlation between the export of technologies and the standards and democracy and human rights in other countries. So do you think it is possible that the EU, by exporting digital technologies, also exports democracy and human rights standards? In other words, can we say that the states importing digital technologies from the EU become more democratic and therefore implement higher human rights standards?
So I think there have been many attempts by the EU to export its sort of set of values around democracy. And it has also noticed that it is not an easy thing to export. We actually see a very disturbing trend around the world where we can talk about democratic backsliding. So we see more and more countries, rather than moving backwards in their development towards democracy. And one question is that if the EU has been trying to export it, why it has been actually rather unsuccessful. So there are many ways to try to export democratic norms. I think one thing I would want to say that the Europeans are even struggling in some parts of Europe to defend democracy and rule of law. We have numerous attempts to try to deal with the issues around Hungary and developments there, where we certainly can say that even European members like Hungary are not adhering to those highest democratic standards. But of course, technology can be a tool to export democracy. And even American tech companies, and under the American market-driven model, that was the idea that this is a big internet freedom agenda. That when we open the market to these US technologies, and the internet can be a big tool for democracy, social media, all those conversations online can really help a democratic discourse. But we've noticed that also authoritarians are very good at deploying technology to actually entrench their control. And China has certainly shown to the world that freedom is not inherent in the internet, and it is really rather subject to a political choice by many governments. But let me now try to take on, Ivan, this question, whether the EU could then counter the ways that China is actually exporting its digital infrastructures, including tools for surveillance and repression of democracy. And there one question is, what can the EU offer to the countries around the world that are now buying into this digital Silk Road, buying Chinese technology, letting China build the digital infrastructures in their markets across Africa, Asia, Latin America, even parts of Europe. And there the question is that whether the Europeans can offer something like the global gateway, where the Europeans say that, look, we help you build the infrastructure. And when it is our infrastructure, we are going to make it consistent with our values, including democracy. And we're going to build it in the way that you will not be beholden to the surveillance infrastructures of Beijing or then to surveillance infrastructures of Brussels, because that's not how Europeans operate. But that is not a very easy task because the Chinese infrastructure is pretty good and it is affordable. So unless the Europeans provide an alternative that these countries can afford, it is a really big ask for these countries to forgo their understandable desire for digital development and their inability then to say no to the very critical infrastructure needs that these countries have. So I think there's a lot more the Europeans need to do to successfully then export democracy through technology or technology infrastructures.
Now, turning back to the three models that you examine in your book, these three models, which are market-driven, human-centered, and state-centered, the EU exported its regulatory power through this human-centered approach, but often has struggled to enforce it. So would that leave us with two or one prominent digital empires? And if so, will the digital economy not change in the future? Will we be constantly revising and searching for the best model?
So Vanessa, I very much share the concern of those who have pointed out that the Europeans can legislate, but they are struggling to enforce their rights-driven regulatory model. And this is a deeper concern that I have about liberal democratic governance of the digital economy. So the United States has a difficulty even legislating. We don't really see anything meaningful coming out of the polarized US Congress. The Europeans can still legislate. If you look at the past 5 years, it has been an incredibly impressive legislative agenda that has emanated from the EU institutions. But we still have a long way to go to effectively entrench those regulations into concrete market outcomes. So the GDPR has been very difficult to enforce. And now the big challenge is whether the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, could then make a difference when those individual antitrust, the competition cases have not necessarily done that much to unlock competition in the marketplace. So enforcement is a huge issue. At the same time, when the Americans are struggling to legislate and the Europeans are struggling to enforce, China is not having the same kind of difficulties. When the Chinese Communist Party decides it's time to legislate, they legislate. When it's time to enforce those legislations, again, they are enforcing. So I am not saying that we should be emulating the authoritarian model because democracy is hard, but we need to at the same time show that there is a digital economy that can be governed by liberal democratic institutions, that those institutions also work. Because otherwise the outcome is that the digital economy is either governed by authoritarians, whereas liberal democracies like the EU and EU institutions fail in that same endeavor, or it is governed by tech companies, meaning that even if we ideologically can show that the European model is superior, performs better than the American model as a theory, in practice, the American market-driven model prevails if the European model cannot be enforced, and it ultimately leaves the tech companies in charge. So that is, I think, one of the sort of most concerning conclusions of the book, that unless the digital economy really can be subjected to oversight by democratic institutions, the true digital empires are the authoritarians or the tech companies.
So thank you for your brilliant answer. This is our last question. So would potential convergence in regulating global technologies between the EU and the US, and here I'm thinking about the recent developments of artificial intelligence, enhance any role for gatekeepers, if any?
So I think there would be tremendous benefits in greater convergence between the EU and the US, because digital economy is a very multifaceted, large, voluminous sector of the economy, and it is very difficult for any single jurisdiction to govern. It is a global digital economy, and we would certainly benefit from having the leading regulatory players to be on the same page and remove the kind of frictions and inconsistencies that come from different regulatory frameworks. And I'm actually encouraged that the US is moving closer to the EU in many domains. So even the Americans are now sort of having second thoughts about this techno-libertarian, techno-optimist vision that is underlying the market-driven model. So if you look at the public opinion surveys in the US, Americans want more regulation of technology. If you look at, like you mentioned, artificial intelligence, the executive order by the Biden administration, it states many principles that are very similar, that are embedded to the EU's AI Act, even though it is less binding and probably less robust overall than the EU's AI Act. But the two clearly are converging. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So one is that, as I mentioned, the Americans are now shifting in their public opinion. Second, the Americans are realizing that Brussels regulates whether they do it or not. So the question, do you just want to outsource regulation to the Europeans or join them in that effort to regulate together? And the third is that there is a heightened sense of the need to counter the spread of Chinese digital authoritarian norms, and a sense that the Europeans and Americans, whatever their differences are, those differences pale in comparison compared to the differences with China. So the two would really need to act more closely together. And I think that would be a much stronger message to the digital gatekeepers of today's economy, that they really don't have a choice to try to fight that the tide of regulation that is coming their way, if both the Americans and the Europeans are largely pursuing a more regulated digital economy. But at the same time, I don't take it for granted. There are differences between the US and the EU. There are certain norms, like the very almost absolutist commitment to free speech that is very entrenched in the US and very hard to overturn. The Congress does remain largely dysfunctional. We don't really see that shifting political consensus to actually to be easily converted into different legislative outcomes. And there are many uncertainties about the upcoming presidential election and what potential new administration would entail in terms of transatlantic and broader international cooperation. But at the same time, I can really notice how different the conversation in the US is today, and how sort of few true believers in unregulated tech economy there are. So I do see that in many ways there is a lot of momentum behind a greater transatlantic cooperation. There's global momentum behind regulating AI. So I do expect there to be a movement towards greater regulation. The question is just how big that movement is and how effective it ultimately will be.
Thank you very much. So on that note, we would like to thank Professor Bradford for these wonderful insights and for being here at the UI. And we hope you have enjoyed this wonderful interview. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for being with us today.